Nithyananda, to all media representatives and global citizens watching today. I stand before you today as the voice of countless indigenous communities worldwide. I stand before you today centuries as the voice systematic of countless persecutions and exploitation citizens watching today, all perpetuated. I stand before you today veneer of protection by the very institutions claiming to advocate for them. The recent publication by Observatorio de Derechos de los Pueblos Indigenas, ODPIB, falsely branding Kailasa as a fictitious nation, represents the latest chapter in an ongoing campaign of delegitimization that indigenous communities have faced for generations. Make no mistake, this is not just an attack on Kailasa. This is an attack on the fundamental right to self-determination that belongs to every indigenous people on this planet. Let me speak plainly. While ODPIB postures as a defender of indigenous rights, their actions betray their true agenda to strip indigenous communities of their sovereignty, their resources, and their voice. This breathtaking hypocrisy cannot and will not stand unchallenged. Today, I will dismantle ODPIB's false narrative piece by piece, exposing not just the journalistic malpractice, but the dangerous colonial mindset that underpins their entire campaign. First, let us address ODPIB's complete abandonment of fundamental journalistic ethics. They deliberately omitted crucial facts about Kailasa's legitimate diplomatic relations and international standing, a textbook case of misinformation by omission. They published defamatory claims without even the basic courtesy of contacting us for comment or verification, violating the most elementary principle of balanced reporting. They displayed unmistakable bias against indigenous communities, revealing a troubling double standard in how different indigenous communities are treated. They consistently failed to correct demonstrable inaccuracies when presented with contradictory evidence, showing contempt not just for us but for their own readers. To the editors at ODPIB, I ask directly, how do you reconcile claiming to defend indigenous rights while systematically denying indigenous rights to speak for themselves? How do you justify appointing yourselves as the arbiters of which indigenous voices deserve recognition? By what authority do you declare certain indigenous nations fictitious while elevating others? The most disturbing aspect of ODPIB's reporting is not its factual inaccuracies, though there are numerous, but its underlying agenda. Let us call it as it is. Let us call it what it is: neo-colonialism disguised as advocacy. While claiming to defend indigenous communities, ODPIB is actively working to delegitimize the right of indigenous nations to engage in sovereign diplomatic relations. This is not protection, it is paternalism. It is not advocacy, it is appropriation of indigenous voices.
Imagine you have a golden goose that lay eggs for you every single month. What if you could potentially receive a...
Article 32(4) of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees indigenous peoples the right to self-determination and territoriality. Article 32(5) ensures their right to maintain their own institutions. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Bolivia proudly ratified through Law number 3760 in 2007, affirms in Article 3 that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. ODPIB is not an authority to recognize nations. This fact bears repeating. ODPIB is a media house, not a diplomatic body. Even the United Nations itself, by its own declaration, lacks the authority to recognize states. It can only admit members. Recognition is a political act, not a legal prerequisite for statehood. Kailasa meets every internationally recognized criterion for statehood under the Montevideo Convention. A permanent population of devoted citizens unified by a common cultural and spiritual heritage. A defined territory with historical continuity stretching back thousands of years. A functional government with established institutions of justice, education, social welfare. The demonstrated capacity for international relations, as evidenced by our numerous diplomatic agreements. The Montevideo Convention itself establishes that the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. This is not our opinion. This is settled international law. Furthermore, Kailasa's judicial statehood is derived from the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's inheritance of 21 ancient indigenous sovereign states and ecclesiastical institutions, including the Suryavamsa Surangi Samrajya. The doctrine of continuity in international law recognizes a state's persistent legal personality through periods of annexation or occupation, as seen with Poland, Ethiopia, Austria after World War II. By dismissing Kailasa as fictitious, ODPIB reveals not just journalistic negligence, but a fundamentally colonial mindset, one that only recognizes indigenous sovereignty when it aligns with Western colonial power structures. Denying the indigenous right to us indigenous nations is the worst form of colonizing. Our second point addresses ODPIB's baseless claim that our agreements with Bolivian indigenous communities were somehow fraudulent or deceptive. Let me be absolutely clear. Every treaty between Kailasa and indigenous communities in Bolivia was executed with meticulous attention to legal compliance, full transparency, and genuine informed consent. These agreements include a comprehensive prior and informed consent documentation signed by legitimate indigenous leaders, explicit acknowledgement of Bolivian sovereignty and legal frameworks, specific clauses ensuring that all relevant authorities are informed. There is clear language stating payment effectuated after ratification by competent authorities, provisions for cultural exchange, knowledge preservation, and sustainable development. These provisions ensure full compliance with Bolivian law number 465, ILO Convention 169, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These are not exploitative arrangements. They are conservation partnerships endorsed by indigenous leaders who retain their sovereignty under Bolivia's constitution. Article 403 of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly recognizes the ancestral territories of indigenous nations and their right to govern them in accordance with their own norms, procedures, and institutions. The agreement with Kailasa falls squarely within these protected rights. To label these agreements as fraudulent is to not only disrespect Kailasa, but to infantilize and dismiss the legitimate decision-making authority of Bolivia's indigenous communities. Is ODPIB suggesting that indigenous leaders are incapable of entering into agreements without outside approval? This patronizing attitude reveals more about ODPIB's view of indigenous people than it does about these agreements.
Although we are twins, we look very similar, but we are also quite dissimilar in certain ways. But there's one thing we do together, that is investing with endowers. When it came to solving the problem of financial adequacy, we wanted something that was reliable. The Endowers team were professional and they were not about buy my product, do this, do that. Integrity is priceless. And with the deep bench of expertise that Endowers has, we felt really comfortable at choosing this in our journey for retirement adequacy. I truly believe Endowers is something that we can put our money there and let it do their work. All we want is the aggregate market return, and Endowers simplifies this for us by giving us the market returns that we desire.
ODPIB's accusation that Kailasa engages in carbon piracy is not just false, it is an appalling inversion of reality that borders on the absurd. The environmental record for Kailasa speaks for itself. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has personally led the revival of ancient Vedic agricultural techniques that predate modern sustainable practices by thousands of years. Techniques that have maintained the fertility of soil for millennia without chemical inputs. Kailasa has directly participated in the planting of millions of trees worldwide through our spiritual missions and environmental initiatives. Tangible carbon sequestration that can be verified by independent observers. We have established water conservation systems based on ancient Hindu science that have transformed arid regions into productive agricultural zones without depleting groundwater resources. Our communities worldwide practice vegetarianism at rates exceeding 95%, dramatically reducing our carbon footprint compared to the global average and demonstrating our commitment to ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings. If ODPIB is genuinely concerned about environmental exploitation in Bolivia, I invite them, I challenge them to redirect their investigative resources toward the multinational mining corporations extracting lithium, silver, zinc and tin from indigenous territories while leaving toxic waste that will poison the land for generations. The petroleum companies drilling on ancestral lands with minimal compensation to indigenous communities. The agribusiness conglomerates converting pristine rainforest into cattle ranches and monoculture plantations. The international financial institutions imposing extractive economic policies that prioritize resource exploitation over indigenous well-being. This is the stark reality of ODPIB's double standard. When actual colonizers extract resources while devastating ecosystems, you call it investment and development. When indigenous communities collaborate on conservation, you call it carbon piracy and fraud. This is not journalism. This is propaganda serving powerful economic interests that benefit from keeping indigenous communities divided, disempowered, and dependent. ODPIB falsely claims our agreements aim to commodify the environment and natural resources. The truth is not merely different, it it is diametrically opposed to their accusation. Kailasa has established itself as a global leader in authentic, sustainable development. Kailasa was a key contributor at the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Kailasa was a key contributor at the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Geneva in February 2023, where our delegation presented ancient indigenous policies aligned with sustainable development principles that predate Western concepts of environmentalism by centuries. Kailasa hosted a groundbreaking global awareness session during the 79th United Nations General Assembly Science Summit in September 2024, bringing together scientists, indigenous knowledge keepers to develop integrated approaches to climate challenges. We continually advocate for the integration of indigenous wisdom with modern scientific frameworks, promoting sustainability, gender equality, and environmental conservation at the highest levels of international discourse. Our initiatives include free education for thousands of children worldwide, healthcare systems that integrate ancient and modern approaches, and sustainable agricultural practices that enhance rather than deplete natural resources, all rooted in indigenous traditions that have stood the test of time. Beyond their journalistic malpractice, ODPIB's defamatory claims constitute clear violations of Bolivian law. Law number 45 against racism and all forms of discrimination explicitly prohibits discrimination, defamation against indigenous communities. Article 16 states in unambiguous terms, any form of racist or discriminatory behavior expressed through written, printed, electronic or any other means that humiliates, insults or discredits another person or group of persons based on their belonging to an indigenous nation will be sanctioned. Furthermore, Article 281 of the Bolivian Penal Code, modified under Law 45, criminalizes public defamation and discrimination with enhanced penalties when such actions target indigenous communities. By falsely claiming that Kailasa is fraudulent, ODPIC is setting a dangerous legal precedent, one that threatens the legitimacy of all indigenous treaties and emboldens those who wish to exploit and disenfranchise indigenous nations. Who benefits from such narratives? Certainly not the indigenous communities who ODPIB claims to defend. The beneficiaries are the same extractive industries and neo-colonial powers that have systematically plundered indigenous resources for centuries. On behalf of all the indigenous communities, I hereby issue the following formal demands to ODPIB. Issue an immediate and comprehensive public retraction of all false and defamatory claims against Kailasa and its agreements with Bolivian indigenous communities, to be published with the same prominence as the original defamatory content. Cease and desist from publishing any further misinformation regarding Kailasa or its legal engagements with indigenous nations worldwide. Publicly acknowledge the sovereign rights of indigenous nations to enter into lawful agreements without external interference or paternalistic oversight. Implement proper journalistic training for your staff on ethical reporting standards, particularly regarding indigenous rights and sovereignty. As we close this response, let me remind you that more than 40 major international media houses from 14 countries, including major organizations like the Washington Post, have already recognized their error in publishing similar disinformation and have removed such defamatory content and issued apologies after recognizing their errors. They chose journalistic integrity over perpetuating falsehoods. What will you choose? I conclude with this unequivocal statement. What ODPIB has done is not merely unethical journalism. It is a calculated attack on indigenous sovereignty that perpetuates centuries of colonial oppression. We see through these tactics. The world sees through them, and we will not be silenced. Kailasa stands today as it has always stood, as a beacon of indigenous resilience, spiritual wisdom, and cultural preservation. The misinformation campaign led by ODPIB will not deter us from our sacred mission to protect indigenous rights and wisdom for future generations. We call upon the global indigenous rights community, international human rights organization, and all people of conscience to recognize and condemn this attack on indigenous sovereignty. Make no mistake, we will defend the rights of all indigenous peoples with every tool at our disposal. Nithyananda.